It is good to have you. Welcome. My name is Brannen. I get the privilege of being lead pastor here, and I'm grateful that you're joining us. I know this every year, a pretty key marker that it's summertime for me is I go to youth camp. So this will be like, I think, my 5th year in a row going to youth camp. So starting tomorrow, we're sending 30 of our Redemption youth and leaders off to youth camp. So a couple things. One, would you pray for our youth as we are away? And particularly pray for me, because I'm going to have no sleep. I don't operate good with no sleep, and so definitely want prayers. And then number 2, set expectations on how I'll look next week. And so if I look like maybe I'm hungover, it's not a real hangover, it's a youth camp hangover, because I didn't get any sleep all week. So be in prayer for that. Also want to draw your attention before we dive into the text to something that's really, really important. Again, you know, whether it's youth camp or whether it's our kids, our youngest ministries, we believe that it is our sacred responsibility to pass the baton of faith. Like, we have that responsibility, one generation to the next. And so as you came in, you noticed that this building to my left over here is being remodeled and renovated. So let me kind of give you a June update on what's been happening with that renovation. We have finally received, are you ready for this? The approved permit to start the work. Yes. It only took us 7 tries. 7 tries. We did it. Very proud of our team. And so that's actually huge news. So we got that a few weeks ago. And so we've been able to really begin a lot of the work that was needed. So as you came in today, you may have seen things like the old wall AC units. We have already taken those out. We're going to re-brick over that area. We've gotten the first phase of plumbing done over there. So we needed to move restrooms for our youngest ones. So that building will house nursery through pre-K ministries on Sundays. Did you know this? We could have, especially in the spring and fall, up to 50 kids in those ministries, any service. I mean, a ton of kids. So we're growing out of these 2 rooms. We got to put them over there. We need to add rooms and more square footage. So we've begun the process of moving bathrooms. That's beginning to be done. And then part of our pass the baton is we got to re-roof this building right here. It's pretty important. So our plan was we'll do that in the fall. And then we had our first kind of wave of like hard rains a couple weeks ago. And we realized, oh my gosh, we need to do that like right now. So we have a couple leaks, but good news, in the next week and a half, 2 weeks, this will be completely re-roofed. And so yes, that's big deal. And so that's where we're at work-wise. Our hope is fall. We open that space up, and then we begin to renovate the current pre-K and nursery space. We're going to have a cafe out in the lobby. It's going to be really awesome. But to give you a financial update, so our goal was $100,000. That's the goal right there. And then we have committed almost $420,000. And so we're at 76% of our goal. Thank you so much. And then what's actually been given, so we had some people that made monthly commitments over the next year, but what's actually been given is a little over 300 so far. So we've begun to be able to get a lot of that work done. So thank you so much for your faithfulness. I would encourage you in this way. First, be in prayer. Our goal is that we're able to open that in the fall. We need it for the fall. We definitely need it for the fall. Our last week, kind of before summertime hit, we had about 550 people in attendance, and our nursery and pre-K ministries were bursting at the seams. It's only going to get worse in the fall. So we need to open that up. Our goal would be September, October, preferably September. We open that up and have more space for our kiddos. And then if you made a commitment of any kind, we've kind of scheduled out work based on the commitments that were made. And so I would encourage you, stay faithful with that. All right, let's dive into the text. So we are in Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I think what makes this sermon stand the test of time, and what I mean by that is what interests people back then, it's still like, it brings so much interest to us today. Like, why is it so interesting? How did it stand, 2,000 years worth of teachings, and how does it still stand as a really key indicator of if we're living a kingdom life or not? And I think part of that is how radical and provocative the teachings are. I mean, when you read this sermon, you're like, okay, this is so countercultural, counterintuitive. Everything about this sermon makes me think a little bit. I mean, he begins the sermon by saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. Okay, our culture doesn't value anything that's poor. And Jesus, you're going to start a sermon that says, hey, the blessed state, the preferred state are those that are poor in spirit. Like, all right, what else is coming? He goes, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to compare murder and anger. I'm going to compare lust and adultery. I mean, everything that he is teaching is just radically different than what our culture and world teaches. Everything that's inside of us, it's provocative. It starts getting deep at the heart of who we are. But I will say this, today's teaching, out of all the teachings that, again, are very, very radical, this one has a special place, I think, in just how radical it is. I actually think that this particular teaching, if you look at all the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, really highlights just how different kingdom life is than any other kind of life. He says in verse 38, you ready? You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, if you want, you can go into the Old Testament in Exodus, and you can actually find this verse in the Old Testament. This is a verse that when God was giving his law to his people, this was included. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about whenever the Lord gave laws to the Israelites, there were different kinds of laws, right? So they were slaves in Egypt, and now he's taking them to the promised land, and he's establishing a brand new nation. So what does this brand new nation need? Well, they need moral laws, right? This is what, when we think about the laws of God, this is what we tend to think of, the 10 Commandments. You know, you shouldn't murder, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't covet that which is not yours, you shouldn't commit adultery, we should honor our father and mother. Those are moral laws that we find within the commands that God gives. Now, we also find out of all the commands, and there's 600 plus in the Old Testament, that some are ceremonial in nature. What does that mean? Well, how do you interact with a holy, perfect God? How does a sinful, rebellious people approach God? Well, he has ceremonial and sacrificial laws that taught people, all right, this is the kind of sacrifice that you bring to me. This is how the priests are to cleanse themselves and come before me. So he's teaching people how to relate to himself even in the law. And then finally, we have civil laws. So they weren't a nation, they become a nation. They need certain laws that govern how they relate to one another. This is one of those laws, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This was actually given to the judges of Israel, the governing authorities. And they were given this to kind of say, all right, so you have stolen or you have hurt or you have harmed this person. So this is the kind of punishment that comes along with what you have done. It gives them kind of like a measuring stick of how they are to make judgments. Also, this law was given to restrain, this is really pretty important, to restrain revenge. I'll tell you a quick story. This past week, we spent a week on vacation, and it was my 15-year-old, now 15-year-old, it was his birthday, and so I said, hey, you can take your buddies on Saturday. I can't deal with your buddies all week, so we'll bring them back on Tuesday. And so we're driving back on Tuesday, and we are on a beloved road known as I-75. And so we're driving down 75. I'm in the fast lane because that's how I do, and I am behind another car. And I noticed there's a guy that's driving really, really fast, and he gets really, really close to me. And I could just tell he's back behind me going like, come on, like get over. And I'm like, oh, there's nowhere to go. Like I have somebody in front of me. And so the traffic literally comes to a standstill within the next minute. And he pulls around because I'm like, where do you want me to go? He pulls around and he gives me the one finger wave. Now, it wasn't his index finger either. It wasn't like bad boy. No, it was another kind of one finger wave that he gave me. And so here I am, I'm sitting here and I've got, 4 teenage boys with me. And I'm like, how am I going to respond to this? And so I ended up driving him off the road and pulling him out of the car. And I'm like, boys, this is a lesson. Eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, guys. No, I mean, that's what I wanted to do, right? So if I'm hurt or harmed by somebody, I not only want to hurt and harm you, but I want it to be worse. Like I want to take it up a notch. And so what this law did, this civil law, has taught them it's going to restrain revenge and retaliation. Because there's something inside of us that wants more, to get back at an even greater extent than what we have experienced. Now, what I want to do is say that this is how the Pharisees taught this law. They're like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And what they were doing was they were using it to justify their own personal retaliation and vengeance. So if you crossed a religious leader of that day, watch out, because this is what they held to. What they did was they misinterpreted the heart of God. Now, Jesus is about to correct this, but let me just tell you, there's two ways that you can approach the Bible. This is really important. So whenever you're reading the Bible, there's two primary ways theologians say you can read the Bible. The first is called eisegesis. Essentially, what you do is you're going to twist whatever you read to self, to whatever you want, whatever your desires are, you're going to read it and go, oh yeah, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That guy hurt me, I'm getting back at him. And so what they would do is they would twist it. They would literally read meaning into the text. They would take their own desires and import it into their interpretation of the text. Guys, this is a poor way to read the Bible. But people have done this. This is how cults are established. This is how bad biblical teaching happens, right? Is that I read something into the text and it's just not there. There's another way to read the text, and this is called exegesis, or we exegete the text. Literally what I want to do is I want to mine out what is inside of it. I want the meaning to come from the text, not from me. So I don't want to import anything. I just simply want to export, like, God, you said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What does that mean? I'm not going to like twist this and use this for vengeance, retaliation. I want to understand your heart in this. I want to see the meaning from the text. And so this is just a general rule of thumb. Whenever you and I are reading the scripture, we don't read meaning into it. We try to mine and find the meaning in the text itself. And so what Jesus is going to do is he's going to mine the text for us a little bit. You ready? He says, verse 39, but I say to you, he does this 6 times in the text. He gives a command that they've heard and goes, hey, you've heard it said this way. You got it all wrong. You're not exegeting the text well. Let me tell you this. And he says, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. That literally means don't be hostile towards somebody that harms you. So the whole preface of this teaching is, I don't want you to be hostile back to people who hurt you. And what he's going to do is give us 4 examples. The first example is if somebody slaps your cheek. Now, of course, in our day, that would be wildly insulting, right? To be slapped. And what he's talking about is almost like a backhanded slap. In the time of Jesus, it was the epitome of disrespect, the epitome of insult to somebody else. It not just hurt physically, but really what it did was it completely disrespected and disregarded the person. And he goes, all right, if somebody does the most insulting thing to you, here's what I want you to do. You ready for this? This is radical and this rails against everything inside of me. He goes, I want you to then offer the other cheek. And Jesus, you can't be serious, right? You cannot be serious. Somebody does something insulting to me, Lord, they deserve some kind of payback. Like I've got to give some justice here to them. He goes, no, the way that you usher in the kingdom is you offer the other cheek. Another example he gives, if you're being sued and you have to give up your tunic. Now, by the way, they didn't have huge wardrobes back then. Yesterday, I spent some time reorganizing my closet. And by my closet, I mean my wife's shoes. And so we're reorganizing. It's fine. She's in here. She's fine with it. She's smiling. I'll probably hear about it later on, but it's fine. We're doing good. We're reorganizing, right? And I realized just as we're reorganizing, I'm like, man, we just have so much stuff. Like in America, we don't even think about it. We just have shoes and clothes. But back then, you had like one garment that would clothe you, and that's your tunic. And then you'd have this jacket kind of thing that would be cloak right over it. Because if somebody sues you and you have to give up your one garment, something that's really important to you, give them the cloak as well. What? Like Jesus, again, this is playing with me right now. This is railing against everything inside of me. Like if somebody sues me, like I want to go after them. This is why we live in such a culture where if I get sued, then I'm going to sue you back, and it's going to be more and worse. Jesus goes, the way you usher in the kingdom is not that way. He says, hey, if somebody makes you walk a mile, walk a certain distance, walk another mile with them. What? Jesus, like, what do you mean? Well, back then, a Roman soldier could actually require you to carry their stuff, whatever distance they wanted. So you would have to carry their personal luggage or baggage or whatever they needed. And you would just have to carry it. They have nothing. They're not holding anything. And you're holding all their stuff. And they could require you to do that. And Jesus goes, if they make you do that, though it feels unfair, what I want you to do is then offer to go even further than what is required. And the last example that he is teaching is one that if somebody's begging of you and has need. Now, think about the scope here. Jesus is teaching about people who have hurt us. So I know whenever we read this, and I've read this before and go, okay, wait, Jesus, verse 42, give to the one who begs from you. Like, if I'm going down the road and there's somebody begging on the side of the road, does that mean I'm supposed to give them something? They're wanting money. Am I supposed to give them something? Again, just remember the context of this. Somebody has hurt you. They're known to you. Maybe you consider them an enemy and they're in need. Here, I don't think Jesus is saying every time you pull up to a red light, you're supposed to give money to the person begging. I don't think that's what he's getting at. And I don't think that would be healthy often to the person asking. What he's getting at is somebody has hurt you, harmed you, and now they have a need. And what are you to do? Are you to ignore it? Are you to celebrate? Yes, finally, the Lord is serving a plate of justice to them right now. I love it. He goes, no, I want my people to live with an open hand. I want my people to meet that need. Again, as I read these examples, I could just be blunt and honest with you. There's nothing inside of me that celebrates this. Inside of myself, I'm like, Lord, this is unfair. Are we just supposed to be doormats? Like we get insulted, we get sued, we get forced to do things we shouldn't or don't want to do. We find an enemy is in need and you want us to meet this need. And Jesus is like, that's how the kingdom is ushered in. And Jesus not only taught this, but he gave us the supreme example of this. 1 Peter 2:21 and 23 says this. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. Being pretty clear, Jesus has given you a very clear example, and you and I, if we're truly followers of Jesus, we walk right behind him, and this is what he did. He committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus has done nothing wrong. There is no sin. He's committed no sin. There's not deceit found in his mouth. He is the example of perfection and holiness. And yet, what does he do? He suffers at the hands of his enemies. He dies on a cross in our place for our sins. And he goes, and now you follow my example. Again, if you read this and you're like, this is easy, go back and reread it. I found myself struggling this week. This is one of those messages, it's easier to preach than to practice. Like, I could tell you what to do, and if you're like, all right, show me, I'm like, well, I don't know, you should look to Jesus, not to me, because I'm terrible at this. That's what this feels like to me. And yet Jesus not only taught that his followers usher in the kingdom, Jesus himself ushered in the kingdom through loving his enemies, through turning the other cheek, through offering up his cloak along with his tunic, to going above and beyond what was required, to helping those in need, us. Friends, the kingdom is ushered in this way. Now, Jesus isn't done, right? So, okay, I'm like, all right, I'll turn the other cheek. I'll muster up the courage, or muster up the will to offer up my cloak. And what I've found is when I try to do that, there's still a piece missing, and he's not going to let a piece miss. This is what he says in verse 43. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, that is not found in the Bible. The front end of that is found in the Bible, love your neighbor. But to hate your enemy is not found in the scripture. So again, what they were doing is they had this very narrow definition of neighbor. So they're teaching this, hey, yes, love your neighbor as yourself. You guys know this is in the Old Testament. And so love your kin, love your family, love your friends, love those in your circle, your tribe. But listen, those that aren't our neighbors, feel the freedom to hate them. And Jesus goes, whoa, you're trying to read something into the text that isn't there. I want you to mind to find out what is there. Neighbor, if you look at like the definition, it literally means nearest one. Those that are around us. Those that may not be part of our tribe. Those that may have hurt us. Those that may have done something to bring harm. They may be the nearest one to us. And Jesus goes this, verse 44. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Verse 45, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you only greet your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect. That Greek word can literally mean mature, whole, as your heavenly Father is perfect. He goes, divine love is a lot different than worldly love. Worldly love, again, loves those that are lovable. Like, it's easy for me to love my wife and kids, right? I find her beautiful, attractive. I love her personality. I love my kids. They're my kids. But if we're talking about other people's kids that are really annoying, get in trouble, like, I don't know about that, Lord. He goes, hey, even the Gentiles greet, even the tax collectors love those that are lovable and desirable. That's worldly. But supernatural divine love loves those that are unlovable, loves enemies. He uses this example like we all need rain to survive, and the Lord gives common grace, not saving grace, but common grace to all people. So when it rains in Lakeland, does the Lord give rain to both the believer and those that reject him? Absolutely. He goes, that's the kind of love that I desire for my people. Augustine, he said this. He was an early church father. He said, many have learned how to offer the other cheek, but do not know how to love him by whom they were struck. Whew. All right, Jesus, like you're going all in with this thing. Like, okay, the first part, easy. All right. Again, I'm going to muster up the will to turn the other cheek. They said something nasty about me. I'm not going to say anything nasty about them. But now you actually want me to love them. Yeah. And I think to put it in a very succinct, concise way, Jesus is teaching love is the retaliation. To usher in the kingdom, love is the retaliation. And so how do we practically do that? Well, you know that there's 4 accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, Luke also records this sermon. And he includes a piece of the sermon that Matthew does not. And I found that it's incredibly helpful to teach us how do we love our enemies. Here's what we know. Love is not just a feeling, right? He's like, all right, get all the warm, what I want you guys to do, I want my followers to have all the warm fuzzies about those that hurt them. No, often what love looks like is I do something even in spite of how I feel. And I think what he does is he outlines in Luke 6, this recording, this sermon of exactly how do we do that well. It says this, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, same teaching. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. So what does he say? How do we retaliate with love? Well, first is we do good. While our enemy seeks our harm, seeks to hurt us, seeks to bring evil, to usher in the kingdom and live as kingdom citizens, we are to do good to them. I know it feels very counterintuitive, countercultural. Everything inside of me rails, but Jesus says this is the way of the kingdom. I'll give you a really striking example. Some of you may remember in 2006, there was a little Amish community just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was just a normal day. The kids were gathering in the schoolhouse. It was West Nickel Mines Amish school. The kids were there, and the milkman, Charles Roberts, who was the milkman of this area, he came there on this pretty regular, mundane day. He brought a gun, and he shot inside the schoolhouse, killing 5 of the schoolgirls, and then ultimately taking his own life. Now, everything inside of me, I want justice, right? By the way, it's not wrong to long for justice. But Jesus entrusted justice to the Father. And so what you see in this striking example is how they responded to this horrific act. The next day, the grandfather of one of the girls came out and publicly said that he forgave Charles Roberts. Hey, let's not act like they didn't love those kids like we love our kids. Let's not try to minimize the radical act of extending forgiveness to a killer. Then they went over and they comforted his family. I mean, what kind of grace, what kind of love is that? later on in the week, they actually invited his family to the funeral of one of the girls. I mean, it doesn't compute inside of me. And also at his funeral, it was noted that the Amish community outnumbered the non-Amish community at the funeral of the killer. Listen, I don't understand it, but I know it's not from the world. It must be from God. Did they want justice? Absolutely. Were they in pain? Absolutely. And yet, they followed the teaching of Jesus to do good, even in the midst of their pain. Then he says, bless those that curse you. The curse is, I'm going to project evil and harm into somebody's life. You know, some of the most memorable moments of our life, in a bad way, are when somebody we love has cursed us. You know, that seems to be the loudest voice. Maybe it was a parent and they said something to you. Maybe it was a classmate. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it was a family member. Yeah, see? Amen. And they cursed you. And it just sits deep inside of your mind and inside of your heart, and you replay it over and over. And it's like poison to your soul. Jesus goes, no, my people, no, they don't curse. Those that even curse them, no, they bless those. Dallas Willard, he says, this is what a blessing is. A blessing is the projection of good into the life of another. And so I'd encourage you in a couple ways here. Whenever somebody is speaking ill of you, they're seeking to bring harm through their words to you, they're gossiping about you, we be very careful when we watch our speech. We watch what we say. We don't speak ill of them. We don't curse. No, we speak life. Proverbs says the power of the tongue can bring life or death. Like there's power in our words. The things that come out of our mouth actually matter deep within our soul. There's an old saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but your words cannot hurt me. No. Again, we know some of the loudest voices in our head are the ones which we were cursed and they hurt us. Like a broken leg hurts the body, cursing hurts the soul. And we know it does. And so for us, we watch our speech. We don't gossip about them. We bless them when we can. We speak good of them when we can. We don't try to create teams and sides. And then next, I think another way we can bless those that curse us is that we can repair what has been broken. What do I mean by that? Well, often whenever we find ourselves at odds with somebody, something's happened, right? And here's what I've learned over the years. My hands are never clean in any situation. Never completely. Like at some level, I've said something, I've done something, I've added to the tension somehow. And so sometimes what we need to do is we need to go back and we need to begin to repair what was broken, what we said, what we did, and we extend blessing to them. Sometimes even blessing somebody is offering verbally forgiveness to them, that I forgive you for what you've done. And last, he says, pray for those who abuse you. Notice this. Jesus doesn't say just be a doormat and just let people keep running over you and running over you and running over you and running over you. Notice he does not say that. Sometimes we need separation. I want to be very, very clear. If somebody is in an abusive relationship, there needs to be separation. There needs to be space. We would never encourage somebody to stay in a dangerous, toxic environment. But Jesus also says sometimes you're not in that environment, but you're praying for them. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a pastor in Germany during the rise of the Nazi regime. And he ended up being jailed for his views and his disagreement with the Nazi regime. Ultimately, he was killed by them. But he said this about praying for our enemies. This is what it's like. It's like I bring the person that has hurt me, I bring them before the throne room of God, and on their behalf, I pray. Again, guys, this is easier to preach than to practice. But I think even in this instance, you have Jesus who not only tells us to do this, but he practices it. On the cross, you may remember his final moments, his darkest moments. He's been beaten, he's been betrayed, he's been nailed to a cross, he's being mocked, he's being reviled. And what does he do? He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And if you read the Greek there, you understand the Greek there, it literally means this was a repetitious prayer. So here he is hanging on the cross, being mocked, being reviled. He's going, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Father, he's just repeating it over and over. That's what it looks like. Jesus is teaching us that love is the retaliation. And counter to that, I would say this. If there is bitterness in your heart, if there's unforgiveness inside of you towards somebody else, that again is like drinking rat poison and hoping they die. It will destroy your soul. I'm not saying you have to trust the person again. There's a difference between trust and forgiveness. There's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Reconciliation requires two parties. Forgiveness requires one. But I do know this, Jesus has called us to love as the retaliation. And so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna give us all a moment just to consider and pray. And so some of you may actually need to go before the throne of God and bring somebody with you right now and pray for that person. Some of you may just need to pray for your own heart. I mean, this is kind of where I am. It's like, Father, I don't wanna pray for them. I don't want to do good. I don't want to bless them. And so, Father, I need you to give me a heart like your heart. And so maybe that's your prayer today. Whatever it is, I'm going to give you a moment right now. If you don't mind, bow your head. And however the Holy Spirit is leading you, I'm going to encourage you to pray.